Hi, welcome to Let's Talk About Mental Health. I'm Nels Kloster. I'm an addiction psychiatrist.
And I'm Robert Stack. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor.
Yeah, and as a reminder, for contacting us or viewing previous episodes, we have a Facebook site as well as an email. And www.facebook.com/Let's Talk VT, or for videos online at the BCTV site, brattleboro.tv.org/let's-talk. Great. And so this is actually our 101st episode. We've been doing this as a live show, a weekly live show, and we're getting ready to sort of change the formats. This will be the last time we do this as a weekly live episode, right?
Well, yes. It's been an interesting progression as we went along. I mean, I remember when I first started by myself and did like my lectures. I had little lectures, and I realized I need help, and that's when I asked you to join me. And we've done a whole series of things. And one of the things that worked was we did some questions from folks. We did questions about illnesses, medication, things like that. And some of the best shows, not best, but some of the more interesting shows when we had guests on. Dr. Leslie Fisherman, when she was on, and some of her discussions with us.
Mary Ellen Copeland was always a popular one as well,
times.
with the RAP, Wellness Recovery Action Programs.
And we had Robert Whitaker,
right,
who wrote
Anatomy of an Epidemic, Mad in America, and Under the Influence.
Right. So we had Liz Lorman, PhD, Dr. Lorman, and she was on. And we had her through Skype.
Yeah, and then Beatrice Birch with Inner Fire in Brookline.
And mostly, though, one of my ideas at the beginning was that we should be of some help.
Yeah.
And that I really wanted to help, people with mental illness and addiction, people who were struggling. I wanted to talk about recovery. And that was really why we wanted to talk more about mental health, about people getting better, but also to speak out to families, to talk a little bit about codependency and how it affects the families and things like that. And so we've had it's been a live show. And so, it's in some ways it's sort of restricted who we could have on and when we had them on and things like that. So I'm actually looking forward to the future and seeing if there's other ways that we can continue this discussion about mental health.
Yeah, because I think it's such a negative slant that's been there predominantly, where people refer to this as mental illness and people who struggle with mental illness. And really what we've been trying to do, I mean, from the beginning, calling this show, Let's Talk About Mental Health and Addictions, to then just calling it Let's Talk About Mental Health, because, I mean, let's face it, addiction deserves a place with schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, and the various anxieties. But two, none of us are divorced from these sorts of issues at some degree, and I think that we've been trying to normalize this, and I think at the time that we're talking about this, there's been a larger conversation going on in communities as well, and by that, I'm referring directly to unfortunate deaths that have been experienced, whether through suicide or through overdoses. That we're seeing that people are no longer talking about, died unexpectedly, died suddenly, but are coming out and saying, my child died of an overdose. My child took their life prematurely through suicide. Because then we have those talks, and then we start to, normalize might not be the right word, but at least to recognize that this is present and that we all struggle with this to some degree.
Right, and some of this really tied together. When we had Mr. Whitaker on, he talked about the danger of the role of the pharmaceutical companies, and sometimes the almost over-medication, if you will, or high doses of medication. And some of that was to control symptoms, to control behaviors, to make them, I hate to say more normal, but more acceptable. And I remember, and one of the things that really struck me when we talked to Dr. Fisherman was that she said, we not only have to deal with the stigma, but we have to deal with culturally accepting people who struggle with what we consider abnormal behavior. They're not, we all worry about the violence aspect and, the danger and the risk of that, but Sometimes it's just strange behaviors. It's just they're different. They act different. They talk different. And do we as a society allow for that? Do we sort of let that happen? And I've been actually encouraged. I mean, since we've started doing this show, I can think of a couple people who have come to our community, and it's obvious that they struggle, but there's a place for them, and there's a place for them to sort of live their lives. And I don't know if they're on medication or not. I mean, I don't know enough to ask them, but I think there has been some progress, and I think people, even with when Governor Sheldon talked about the epidemic. Now, I don't know if that's the right term. I wouldn't use that term when we talk about what's happened with it. It's not contagious. It's not something you catch walking down the street. I mean, you make a decision to use opiates. I mean, there's more access, there's more availability than there's,
and there's the losing control, the devastation that comes with that. Yeah.
But in the beginning, it's a choice. And I think one of the scary things nowadays is people have realized that there are people who use opiates and they don't get addicted. And there are people who do use opiates and they do get addicted. And you can't, we're trying now to sort of figure out who are we talking about? What are the earlier marks that you want to look for? And what other conditions do you want to be aware of?
Yeah, and other societies too that we've seen, and beyond the United States. For example, looking at say Portugal and their approach to decriminalizing all drugs that are for personal levels of consumption. Scandinavian countries as well, with a more sort of holistic approach that recently come across a book called The American Healthcare Paradox, and I hope we could look at that more in the future with the authors of that book. But it's talking about social determinants of health. So it's not just medicine is not health. It's not medicine is not wellness, and medications are not wellness. But the idea that it's such an interwoven fabric, and that I think some politicians may be sort of starting to mention this, that we're looking at things like trying to avoid trauma in children, these adverse childhood events. You're looking at how housing plays a role in healthcare, how poverty impacts our health, how food scarcity can impact our health, and recognizing that we're spending too much money on medical treatment or psychiatric treatment, and we should be looking at these social determinants of health and wellness that are very, very critical to us being healthy and well. And in a way, the reason we get such bad results from the amount of money that we spend on our health care is because we're ignoring these other social determinants of health. So we're trying to broaden that perspective to get people to see this in a bigger picture.
Yeah, and it's so, well, there's a lot of different things involved. If you don't mind, I'll mention that you work with the Pathways, and that's to find housing for people with mental health, right?
Right.
That's part of it. You also work with people in the field of addiction, and you work in the field of mental health as far as psychiatric illnesses. You've worked in the hospitals, you worked in...
And we're working with economic services, working with housing, working with, organizations like, DCF often being helpful, housing for women who've been, are being abused, voc rehab, for example. There's so much that needs to be brought to bear for everyone to be well and engage socially.
Like I've been doing volunteer work as a guardian ad litem, and one of the things that has happened is heroin, what it's done, and whether or not the babies are safe and the children are safe, and whether or not, it's a very complicated thing. It's very stressful for everybody involved in the system. And in some ways, I won't say it's overwhelmed the system, but it's really, it's not just about, somebody using this drug.
Right.
Its impact is community-wide. Its impact is with the next generation even. What I'm saying is that I think with some of the problems, it isn't just a matter, as you know, of just giving them medicine. It's much more complex than that. And I think there's been a lot of focus on that. My friend Mark Ames was very involved with the recovery centers and turning points, and they have a place at the table. Recovery coaches. I saw in the Boston Globe they were hiring people to be recovery coaches in Mass General. The idea being, that they can talk to them. It's almost like like a sponsor, AA sponsor, only now it's a little bit different. I mean, it's under. So anyway, so I just want to say that this is, we did reach out to the two governor candidates. I called Scott's media director, I'm not sure of his name, but I left a message. We also, from a local representative here in town, we tried to get in touch with Sue Minter's people to have them on and talk a little bit about, we had Sue Minter was very much involved with the storm, and that's sort of like her claim to fame. And, we could talk about the closing of the state hospital. And, okay, so that happened. Now, where did we go from there? Well, we built another place, and but now you hear stories about people being in the emergency room or sitting in the, so there's a lot going on. I think there's a lot that we can, I hope that we continue to talk about, that we continue to bring to the public for discussion.
Yeah, all those ripples. Oh, yeah. And I mean, for current craziness, when you talk about, I mean, again, so we've been trying to keep a very broad perspective, recognizing all the determinants out there, all the different avenues and perspectives on wellness. And the elections that are going on right now, I think, nationally we're seeing almost sort of the opposite of that sort of perspective. We're seeing very narrow points of view, very much people locking into their individual perspectives, and again, develops sort of us versus them, which is the direct opposite of what we've been talking about and trying to achieve through the show, is that the recognition that we're kind of all in this together.
Right.
And how important that is for social wellness.
And when we do read it, and you were talking about it before the show started, about how some people were talking about their anxiety, and someone came to me and talked to me that people are actually anxious about this, and they're getting nervous about what's going on and stuff. And I sort of like history. I enjoy history, and I think, and this is like a pet thing of mine, but cognitive behavioral therapy. And that is, when you're looking at an outcome and you find yourself getting nervous and upset and angry and everything, what you want to do is go back and look at your interpretation. What is your interpretation of the event? And so, just for fun, if you don't mind, I would say that one of the things I enjoy is that this is America. This is our election process. This is what we do. And we've had elections that are, going back into the 19th century, and we have had Polk and Buchanan and the Taylors and Tyler, and, or you can look at Chester Arthur, and, there's just been all kinds of different presidents. And if you look just in our century, Eisenhower, he was a general. We made him president twice. And we had assassination. We had JFK get assassinated. We had Robert Kennedy get assassinated. We had attempted assassination on Ronald Reagan. We had Wilson, who was incapacitated toward the end, and Mrs. Wilson actually helped run the country. I know I'm going on, but I think if you put the election into a historical perspective, if you just looked at it and realized this is America, this is a good thing.
I get fed up with people talking about living in unprecedented times. That the times we're experiencing now are nothing like anything that's ever happened before, and this is a whole new frontier. People have been people. We've been human beings, and as you're saying, this is not necessarily so unprecedented, and that's part of the narrowing scope, right? By getting tunnel vision around this thing, focusing on the negative. I just saw a banner driving on the highway this weekend. It was using the graphics of Bernie Sanders, that sort of light blue background with the stripe through it in the 2016 in the corner, and it said everybody sucks. Right? It was just this idea of the pessimism around these choices. And again, I think that David Brooks, we're our favorite newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post, and a great source of these sort of thoughts. But while he talked about expecting that Trump was going to implode at some point in the primaries, and then recognized that he did not sort of, go away, really indicated that people had underestimated the anger or the fear or the change that people had experienced, that he's been able to sort of tap into. It's like a negative well to sort of keep his message and keep himself, going through the elections.
Yeah, and I don't mean to make light of this. I mean, because it's a big deal, how we deal with Russia. I mean, how do we deal with our neighbor Mexico? How do we deal with, Serbia? How do we deal with that war? Do we send troops? I mean, this is important stuff, and it's worth talking about. And I think in a way it's okay that people are passionate. It's okay that people are sort of like we want our guy. This the only thing that is a little bit worrisome, and this is really politics and maybe not mental health, but you'll have to forgive me. It's this idea that there's something wrong with the process, and that if I don't get elected, that people are cheating or something.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we need a little bit of Al Gore, even when it looked at Florida, and the Supreme Court justice said, we don't want to decide this. We don't want to get into this, and he just said, okay. All right, he won. Bush won.
And there's a difference.
We'll respect the process.
Yeah, and the American Psychological Association and folks are talking about actually sort of naming this thing was a election stress disorder. And I want one more thing to go in the diagnostic and statistical manual, all this sort of silliness of labeling things and things, but talking about the anxiety and the disgust and the disbelief that all the people are experiencing with the quality of the conversations. And you talked about sort of the passion of being for something, but passion is a very more of a positive force that sort of guides you then to be engaged in something. And one of the unfortunate pieces of this is that rather than using the perspective of being for something and being passionate to it, there's been more of this against sort of the discussion that's been going on, which is rather negative and aggressive sort of way of doing that. And I think this is what we have more of back and forth, is rather than, again, the idea of everybody sucks, who are you against more vehemently than who are you for? And that's something that fuels this as well, that people are there using the more sort of primitive areas of their brain that's sort of against the aggression, that's our more sort of brain stem, emotional centers approaches to this or responses to this. Whereas if you look at it just really being passionate and being for something and trying to be mindful of other people's perspectives, this requires we use the cerebral cortex, the higher centers of our brain that have us being able to understand the nuances and the complexity and to be able to see other people's perspectives and not to get so sort of base about the differences of opinion and approaches.
And also, I think it's worth it. There was a Know Nothing party back in the 1800s, and that was against immigrants, and that was against the Irish, no less. I mean, my ancestors. I mean, there's almost a dialectic. It's a discussion. I mean, now we're looking at what talk is allowed. It's not okay to say certain things. It's not okay to do them. It's not okay to joke about them. I don't care if it happens in a locker room. I don't care where it happens. That's not allowed. Yeah. But first we have to put it out there. And we have to say, this is how some people talk. And this is how this is how some people act. And that's not good enough anymore. That's not allowed. Michelle Obama's speech was incredible. Yeah. I do want to, if you don't mind, just to switch for a second, I want to mention something that I was reading yesterday. And that was a woman wrote a sort of self-confession about Adderall. And she talked about her struggle. And she started off as I won't say overachiever, but she was at Brown University in Providence, and that's her first experience with Adderall. And I know of some folks who have gotten in trouble with Adderall, but this is really her life through academic and trying to focus on doing well with papers and everything else. And it's in yesterday's Sunday Times, but it's actually, she goes into talking about she went out to the West Coast, she went to graduate school, she tried to stop a number of times, and she did stop. She would throw all her pills away, and then she would start up again, and she was feeling it. And again, I was struck with so many drugs. When people first start using the drugs, they appear to be beneficial. They appear to be really helpful. You feel very much alive. I mean, you feel focused, excited. your pain goes away, your emotional pain, physical pain. And it's only after you get to that point where it's not just symptom relief, it's not just relief, it is the reason why you're doing it. I mean, you're doing it to do it. You're not doing it to do a paper, you're doing it to do speed, amphetamines, you're doing it to do crack. And I think that's what happens to so many folks, is that they don't, and I know I've said this before, but they don't realize that with certain drugs, it's like playing Russian roulette. And I can't tell you if you're going to get away with socially using that drug. Or I can't tell you that you're going to get away with using that drug without harming another human being or yourself. But there's a chance that you will. There's a chance that you take. And I sort of worry a little bit about that the way people are talking about some of these things these days, it's more like, go ahead and use, because if you get in trouble, we'll take care of you. We'll sort of fix it for you. Now, I don't know if that's actually coming across. I don't know if I'm sort of reading it to something that's not there. But I guess I'm sort of worried that we keep getting more and more people. There's nobody naive about opiates in Vermont. I hope there's nobody in Landmark or Marlboro who's taking Adderall who thinks like, well, it's okay that I'm taking Adderall, it's prescribed, or everybody's using it. I find that worrisome, that there's like a level of acceptance of drug use that I think people are not, I don't know how to explain it. Maybe you can help me with it.
Yeah, I don't know, but it's, and I think it's not just there, but there's this idea of competition and enhancement. I mean, we see it in sports with doping, for example. There's unfair competition, the idea that if I need to get ahead, I deserve a little sort of boost, a stimulant, a drink or what have you. And it seems to be widely accepted, as opposed to sticking with things that work, for example. I think a lot of shortcuts, right? What's that joke? How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, right? Yeah. And then maybe there's a work ethic that seems to be missing.
Now, people know, and you were talking about decriminalization. You know that one of the things that I felt pretty strong about is I was opposed to legalization of marijuana. Yeah. I just didn't think we need another legal drug. Yeah. And that if you make it legal, you'll increase consumption. I just think that will happen. Yeah. And you'll see people using who aren't using currently, or using more than they were using, and it will become a market. And I know we can keep our eye on Colorado and Washington, and I imagine California's getting ready to sort of legalize it. The whole coast. And I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I think it's really about money. I imagine it's going to come up to the legislature again. You're awarding monopolies to people to sell drugs, and selling drugs is very profitable. And I mean, it's so again, when we talk about what we've been trying to do, to have a sort of broad perspective on this. Yeah. Legalizing marijuana, it's commercial, it's hip, it's a great way to get votes. I'd like to see someone take, and again, this is not just sort of my perspective, but a lot of folks who, academics have written great books and a lot of research, are recognizing that the penal system has not been the way to have any kind of an impact on drug use and on our health. And we've seen this with decriminalizing marijuana, that we have not seen an increase in smoking. Vermont doesn't care about people smoking. I mean, we want you to be healthy, we want you to be well. I don't want you driving high and getting in wrecks. But when it talks about using the legal system to pursue people who smoke pot, it's not been on the table in Vermont for like forever. So if we're trying to protect people from more harm than good, decriminalization is fine. It's done. Let it go. Yeah. If we really want to have a progressive picture, I think the next conversation, and I don't think any of our politicians are brave enough to bring up this conversation at this point in time, is to talk about decriminalizing of all drug use. That there's a certain amount of cocaine or heroin or stimulants or methamphetamine that it would be allowable to have possession of
because that would be considered for personal use. They did this in Portugal 10 years ago. They also, however, did it at the same time when they revamped their healthcare system, something we're close to talking about in Vermont. You know, what do we do against social determinants of health as well as medical care? How do you put all this together into a system and a fabric that's going to help all Vermonters thrive? And there's a lot of strong thinking behind the idea that to decriminalize all drug use should be the next step. Legalizing anything new is not the right next step. We need to take this point by point. Some people are calling for legalizing all drugs. Let's stop this business of making it a crime and such. But if you look at it in progressive fashion, we shouldn't be legalizing one more drug before we start to decriminalize other drugs and see what the impact of that might be.
Yeah, and I'm not, you know, when the people came and said, we need it for glaucoma, I have a friend of mine who has trouble with his vision, and he says pot helps him. I believe him, and, you know, I'm all for it, you know. And then they said, well, we got people in jail, and we're spending $30,000, $40,000 a year. Okay, that's silly. I don't want to see people in jail for smoking pot. Okay, we won't do that. I don't think anybody's doing that in Vermont. The trick is, how do you stop the dealer? If everybody's going to have less than 2 ounces, and the last law they tried to pass, they didn't want to let people grow their own. So they want dealers. So how do you know what I mean? Like, you know, if you're going to decriminalize, you're still going to have dealers come in and sell, you know, cocaine and heroin and stuff. And I don't think you want that. I mean, I think that's where it becomes more difficult. Yeah. But I will say this. Recently, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, I was reading it. They were talking about markers and trying to identify kids that are at risk for addiction. Mm-hmm. And again, it's that idea that not all children who use end up addicts, and we want to figure out, well, what's the difference? Who can we help sooner before they get to that place? And I think that is really where we should be putting our efforts in. I mean, more and more. And I'm a little, granted, it's a little bit of a problem when you talk about screening, and you don't want to just identify low-income kids or kids who are acting out for whatever other reason. But I think there is a way of sort of identifying who you might find out who are using in the 10th grade or who are using early on.
But I think that the author who wrote that article in the New York Times talking about this, looking for personality traits in younger children, because he said he himself was, you know, high achieving, you know, smart kid, well-behaved kid, and nobody would have pegged him to be somebody who had troubles with drugs. But then when you talk about a sort of sense of comfort, I think it was, sensation seeking, and I only skimmed the article, but there's a good body of research saying that we could be more precise, and rather than sort of, you know, larger messages of just say no, we could say, you know, your kid's got some traits here that maybe we should sort of look at more focused education on drug use.
I bet you could interview 8th grade teachers and get some idea, or I don't know, the coaches or stuff.
Oh yeah, I mean, how many teachers do you know who have said, I knew that kid was headed for trouble? Okay,
we only got a minute left. Can I give a public service announcement?
Absolutely, Robert, let's have it.
All right, so 6 weeks ago I had open heart surgery, and I walked around for 2 days with chest pain.
Yeah.
And I've had angina for months, if not years, and I just said, well, it's just more of the same. Yeah. And I have since learned that I really messed up.
You ignored some very serious signs, my friend.
And so if you have chest pain, and by the way, don't have your family drive you, call rescue, call 911 and get to the emergency room. And we want to mention that?
Yeah. Absolutely. So, you know, once again, we're going to be changing our format and our approach, more focused programming on specific issues. Yeah. But we've had a variety of episodes going from looking at, you know, identifying mental illness, accepting it, to treatment, larger issues. So, again, please peruse the library, brattleboro.tv.org/let's-talk, or at facebook.com/let's-talk-VT.
And if you have any suggestions about guests or people or topics that you'd like to hear us talk about, please let us know, and be more than happy to do it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.